I sat in that sterile family court, watching my father, Kenneth, destroy what was left of our relationship with every word he spoke. "All she does is embarrass me, Your Honor," he declared, gesturing dismissively in my direction, while arguing why I didn't deserve a single penny from my grandmother Jacqueline's $3,500,000 estate. His voice dripped with disdain as he listed my supposed failures to the judge. I stayed silent, embodying the end of our contract. I didn't flinch. I just watched the clock, waiting for the balance sheet of our life together to finally hit zero. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I sat there while my father's attorney, Marcus, shuffled through his papers with a nervous twitch in his fingers. The hallway outside had smelled like burnt toast and silence, a heavy prelude to the cold sterility of this room. In here, the air was thick with the scent of old mahogany and my father's expensive desperation. Kenneth's voice was a blunt instrument, trying to carve out a version of me that didn't exist for the judge to see. He called me a financial burden. He called me a drain on the family's resources. He told the judge I was unstable and had no future his words meant to ensure I remained written out of grandmother Jacqueline's legacy. I kept wondering when he would realize that the future he was talking about was already dead. I wasn't crying, and I certainly wasn't going to beg for his approval. I didn't even ask why he felt the need to lie so shamelessly. I just looked at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight and started mentally clicking cancel on the life support I'd been providing for his company, Vantage Point. This was the endure phase, the period of silence before the balance sheet was finally settled. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for too long. Now it was time for the quarterly review. Love had been a subscription I was tired of paying for, and I was finally footing the bill for the cancellation fee. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and as of this moment, the account was closed. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold, sharp clarity of an accountant closing a ledger that had been in the red since the day I was born. My mind drifted back to my graduation day, 4 years ago. I had worked 3 jobs to pay for that degree, while Kenneth threw money at his own gambling debts and called it business expansion. I stood there, valedictorian of my class, with a job offer starting at over $100,000 a year. When I showed Kenneth my diploma, he didn't even look up from his phone. "A worthless piece of paper," he'd snapped, his voice echoing in my memory. "It won't teach you anything about real life." Well, here we are in real life. In this courtroom, the numbers don't lie, even if he does. I looked at the judge, Patricia Hernandez. She was an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses that seemed to see right through Kenneth's performance. She had a reputation for thorough preparation and for never being surprised. She was currently looking at a file that Kenneth hadn't seen yet, a file I had ensured was on her desk before the session began. Kenneth continued his relentless assault. He told the court I drifted from one failed venture to another, never contributing anything substantial to society or our family name. He was so loud, so incredibly sure of his own power. He didn't notice Marcus starting to sweat. Marcus was the one who had been processing those mysterious anonymous payments that had saved Vantage Point from total bankruptcy twice in the last 2 years. He knew the source had been hidden behind legal barriers I'd built, but I could see the exact moment he started to connect the dots. I rubbed my eyes momentarily, trying to summon a shred of regret for what was about to happen, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown or a family tragedy, it was a balance sheet. Kenneth was arguing why I didn't deserve my grandmother's $3,500,000, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the only reason he still had a roof over his head. The courtroom was quiet as he finished his rant, but in my head, the clicking had stopped. The life support was gone. I was just waiting for the judge to pull the plug. Judge Hernandez cleared her throat, a sound like dry parchment, effectively cutting through Kenneth's loud demands. "Mr. Kenneth," she said, her voice echoing off the paneled walls. "You claim your daughter has no sense of fiscal responsibility, that she is a drain. Yet, I am looking at a series of anonymous capital injections into Vantage Point over the last 24 months. Do you have any idea where that $650,000 came from? Kenneth blinked, his mouth hanging open for a split second before he smoothed his tie. That was private investment, Your Honor. From a silent partner who recognized the firm's legacy. It has nothing to do with her. I looked at my hands. They were steady. The memory of those 2 years flashed behind my eyes like a film strip. I hadn't been drifting. I had been working 3 jobs. 12-hour shifts in logistics by day. Freelance design projects until 3 in the morning. Consulting for tech startups on my days off. I had lived in a studio apartment that smelled like ramen and exhaustion, saving every cent not for myself, but for the man now calling me an embarrassment. I had established the Creative Fund with one purpose, to keep Vantage Point from drowning. I had quietly transferred $650,000 into his accounts to cover his irregularities and gambling debts. I did it because, at the time, I still believed in the contract of family. I thought if I saved his pride, he might finally see me. But I was caught in the trap of cruel normalization. To Kenneth, my silence wasn't strength. It was a baseline. My giving wasn't a sacrifice. It was a debt I owed for the privilege of having his last name. He had normalized his own cruelty to the point where he truly believed his behavior was standard. In his mind, I wasn't a person with dreams. I was a financial instrument, a cash cow that didn't need to be fed, only milked. This normalization is a trap. It allows the predator to sleep soundly while the prey works themselves to the bone. The silent partner, Judge Hernandez said, her gaze shifting to me, is sitting right in front of you, Mr. Kenneth. The Creative Fund is a trust established and funded solely by Olivia. The silence that followed was heavy. Kenneth's face went through a grotesque transformation, from smug confidence to utter confusion. That's impossible, he finally croaked. She doesn't have that kind of money. She's a freelancer. She's aimless. I didn't answer him. I just watched Marcus, who had finally put down his pen. He was looking at the bank statements on the judge's desk, his face drained of color. He knew the numbers were real. He knew the source was verified. The $650,000 wasn't a gift anymore. It was a recorded entry in a ledger that was about to be audited. My father had spent the morning trying to steal my grandmother's $3,500,000, never realizing I had already spent over $500,000 just to keep him from the gutter. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a hostile takeover. Kenneth's eyes narrowed, the panic in them hardening into a cold, desperate malice. He didn't apologize for his lies, or for the 2 years he'd spent draining my life force. Instead, he straightened his posture and looked at Judge Hernandez, with a face that had perfected the art of the professional pivot. Your Honor, he said, his voice regaining its oily confidence. If Olivia has managed to hide hundreds of thousands of dollars, it only proves my point. She's secretive and deceptive. And I have reason to believe that money didn't come from honest work. He gestured to Marcus, who reluctantly slid a thin blue folder toward the bench. What my daughter isn't telling you is that she has been drowning in secret debt. I have documentation here of multiple high-interest loans totaling over $150,000 taken out in her name over the last 18 months. She's a reckless gambler, Your Honor. She probably used that so-called creative fund as a front to move money she didn't have. I looked at the documents on the monitor as the judge scanned them. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore, because you have to value someone's opinion for it to hurt. I simply observed the forgery. It was a masterpiece of identity theft. My father hadn't just used me as a silent investor, he had used me as a human shield. The secondary twist was now clear. Kenneth had taken out black market loans to cover his mounting gambling losses at the underground tables he frequented. When the collectors came knocking, he didn't use his own name. He used my social security number. He used my identity to secure $150,000 in predatory funding, and now he was standing in a court of law, pointing at the wreckage of my credit wreckage he had systematically created and calling it proof that I was unfit to handle my grandmother's legacy. You're making a mess of things, Olivia, he hissed under his breath, leaning toward me while the judge was occupied with the files. Just give up the estate, and I might help you clean this up. You always were too sensitive to handle the real world. It was classic gaslighting. He wanted me to believe his crimes were my failures. He wanted the courtroom to see a daughter spiraling out of control, not a father who had committed fraud to save his own skin. He thought he was doubling down on his power, but in reality, he was just providing the court with more evidence for his own indictment. I stayed silent, watching his attorney Marcus look like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. The air in the room felt even colder now, stripped of any remaining pretense of family loyalty. I wasn't an addict or a reckless spender. I was a victim of professional sabotage, and my father was about to learn that the real world he kept talking about was far more dangerous than he realized. Judge Hernandez didn't look at the folder Kenneth had provided. She didn't even glance at the supposed evidence of my reckless gambling. Instead, she reached for a heavy, cream-colored folder marked with the official seal of the United States government. The room went so silent, I could hear the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keys. Kenneth was still wearing that small, triumphant smirk, convinced that he had finally buried me under a mountain of my own failures. He was still playing the game of family sabotage, while I was playing a game of federal logistics. "Mr. Kenneth," the judge began, her voice gaining a sharp, authoritative edge that made the air in the room feel even thinner. "You've spent the last hour painting your daughter as a professional non-entity and a fiscal liability. However, this court received a formal inquiry from the Federal Bureau of Investigation 2 weeks ago. They were conducting a comprehensive security clearance investigation regarding Olivia's character and background." Kenneth's smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated. He blinked rapidly, his gaze darting between the judge and me. "The FBI? For what? Why would they care about a freelancer?" "Because," Judge Hernandez continued, unfolding a document on White House letterhead, "Olivia has been selected by the president for appointment as the inaugural director of the $20 million Federal Creative Empowerment Fund. This is a newly created department focused on revitalizing small-scale creative industries across the country." The number $20 million hung in the air like a physical weight. I watched Marcus, my father's attorney, literally freeze in his chair. His pen slipped from his hand, clattering onto the polished table. He understood the professional nightmare that had just landed on his desk. You don't lie to a judge about the character of a presidential appointee. During that investigation, the judge said, her eyes fixing Kenneth with a stare that could have frozen blood, the FBI discovered the true nature of the $150,000 in debt you just presented. They traced the signatures on those black market loan applications. They reviewed the IP addresses used for the digital identity theft. They didn't find Olivia's fingerprints on that wreckage, Mr. Kenneth. They found yours. I leaned back, my posture mirroring the cold finality of the evidence. I didn't feel the need to defend myself because the federal government had already done it for me. This was the professional escalation. The conflict had moved from a mahogany courtroom to a level of scrutiny Kenneth's small-time fraud could never survive. He had attempted to use my identity as a pawn in his gambling addiction, but the background check required for high-level government service had turned that pawn into a queen. Kenneth looked around the room wildly, but Marcus wouldn't even meet his eye. The man who had entered this courtroom as the moral authority was now exposed as a common criminal in the middle of a federal vetting process. The balance sheet had officially flipped. Judge Patricia Hernandez reached into the government folder and pulled out a stack of envelopes that seemed to hum with the weight of stolen time. They were tied together with a faded blue ribbon, the silk frayed at the edges like the remnants of a bond I thought had been severed by choice. I recognized my own handwriting on the top envelope immediately. Beside me, Kenneth's face, which had been a mask of oily confidence, turned a translucent shade of gray. The judge explained, with clinical precision, that these letters were recovered from Kenneth's private home office during the federal security audit of his financial irregularities. For 3 years, I had sent a letter every single month. I had poured my heart out onto those pages, telling Grandmother Jacqueline about my nonprofit work, my smallest victories, and my unwavering love for her. I had waited by the mailbox for a response that never came. I had eventually convinced myself that she had grown tired of my struggles, that she had finally bought into Kenneth's narrative that my career was just book smarts and pretend business. But Jacqueline never saw a single word I wrote. Kenneth had intercepted every single one. It wasn't just the words he stole. Inside, several of those envelopes were small, tangible tokens of my affection. I had included birthday checks for $50 and small contributions at Christmas, hoping to help her with the heating bills he claimed she was struggling to pay. Kenneth didn't just hide those letters, he cashed those checks without her knowledge. He had stolen $50 gifts from his own daughter while I was eating ramen in a studio apartment just to feed his own gambling debts. The judge then produced the other side of the ledger, the letters from Jacqueline addressed to me. In her careful, elegant script, she had been asking why I stopped visiting. She had been begging to know why her only champion had abandoned her in her final years. Kenneth had intercepted those too. He had systematically manufactured a silence between us, telling her I was too busy with my own life to care, while telling me she was too disappointed to speak to me. This was the kill shot. This wasn't a family drama about being overlooked. It was a criminal indictment. Intercepting mail intended for another person is a federal crime. Cashing checks made out to someone else constitutes mail fraud and theft. Kenneth had robbed an 87-year-old woman of the only love she had left, and robbed me of the final years with my confidant. The courtroom was deafeningly quiet. As the judge laid out the federal prison time these charges carried, I didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. I just watched Marcus, who was now frantically packing his briefcase, trying to distance himself from the wreckage. Kenneth wasn't my moral authority anymore. He was just a man who had overdrafted his soul, and the bank was finally calling in the debt. Kenneth straightened his tie, again a reflex of a man trying to inflate a punctured ego. If Olivia is indeed qualified for federal service, he said, his voice gaining a desperate, oily strength, it's because of the foundation I provided through my parenting and guidance. Everything she's accomplished can be traced back to the values and work ethic I instilled in her. Judge Hernandez didn't even look up from her papers. She just smiled, that expression I'd come to recognize as deeply ominous for whoever was on the receiving end. That's interesting, mister. Kenneth, she said, her voice deceptively mild. Because according to these corporate filings from 5 years ago, your mother transferred her partnership shares in Vantage Point to your daughter, Olivia, making her the majority owner of the firm. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Kenneth's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror. I sat there, watching the architect of my misery realize he was a squatter in a house I owned. I was the legal majority owner of the firm with 65% of the shares. I hadn't just been supporting a failing business. I had been unknowingly investing in my own company through the Creative Fund. This was the moment Kenneth's illusion of power finally dissolved. This is what I call the illusion of power from an empty wallet. A man like my father bases his entire identity on having the firm, having the title, having the status. He confused his bank balance with his character for so long that he didn't realize they were two different ledgers. When the money is gone, there is no internal value left to hold him upright. He didn't own his power, he was just renting it, with grandmother Jacqueline's reputation and my secret capital. Now that the lease was up, he was nothing but an empty shell in an expensive suit. He stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward, the sound echoing like a gunshot. This is insane! Olivia can't own my firm. I built that practice. I've worked there for 20 years. You've been the managing partner of a firm majority owned by your daughter, Judge Hernandez said sternly. The woman you've spent today describing as irresponsible has actually been your primary financial supporter and your boss for years. I looked at him not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a creditor reviewing a defaulted loan. I pulled a single-page document from my bag and slid it across the table. It was a contract. You have two choices, Kenneth, I said, my voice steady and factual. The State Bar Association and federal prosecutors are receiving the full files on your embezzlement of client funds and mail fraud. Or you can sign this. You will continue working at Vantage Point as a junior associate under my strict ethical oversight. You will complete a comprehensive ethics program, make full financial restitution of $300,000, and write formal apologies to every client you misled. Your salary will be enough to live modestly while you pay for your crimes. Kenneth stared at the paper as if it were a death warrant. He looked at Marcus, but his attorney was already packing his briefcase to distance himself from the criminal fallout. He was alone. With trembling hands and eyes wet with the first real shame he'd ever felt, he picked up the pen and signed. The finisher was delivered. The balance sheet was finally at zero. Judge Hernandez made the final notes on her documents and looked at me with an expression of profound respect. "This court is adjourned," she declared, her voice firm and final. "Miss Olivia, congratulations on your inheritance and your federal appointment. Mr. Kenneth, you have 30 days to secure new legal representation for the criminal matters you'll be facing." As we gathered our belongings, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that no balance sheet could ever fully capture. There was grief for the years stolen with grandmother Jacqueline, but there was also a deep sense of pride. Walking out of that courthouse, I carried with me a $3,500,000 inheritance, including her house and investment portfolio. But the most valuable asset I possessed wasn't listed on a bank statement. It was the knowledge that I had succeeded on my own merits, while the person meant to protect me was working to ensure my failure. 6 months later, I stood in the Rose Garden as my confirmation as a director of the $20 million federal fund was announced to the public. Kenneth was in the audience, wearing the modest suit of a junior associate, rather than the expensive clothes of a firm partner. He was applauding with what seemed to be genuine pride. For the first time in my life, he had spent the last several months undergoing regular auditing and completing his ethics program, finding a path to redemption through actual work, rather than manipulation. This outcome represents what I call the justice of the planter. Most people think of justice as a transaction of punishment, an eye for an eye, a debt for a debt. They focus on destroying the past. But true justice is about building the future. It is about planting seeds in the wreckage of betrayal. By offering Kenneth a way to rebuild his life through accountability, I wasn't just settling a score. I was breaking a cycle of harm. I chose to be an architect rather than a wrecking ball. When you focus on growth instead of just retribution, your victory becomes a legacy rather than just an ending. The foundation I established in Jacqueline's name has already helped recover over $15 million in stolen assets for victims of financial exploitation. Kenneth has become one of our most dedicated volunteers, using his legal expertise to ensure no other family suffers the deceptions he once practiced. That evening, I visited my grandmother's grave and placed fresh flowers beside her headstone. "Thank you for believing in me," I whispered to the evening air, "and for teaching me that the people who try to diminish us often reveal more about their own limitations than ours. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating those who hurt us, but helping them find a path to become better people. I am no longer the embarrassment or the burden. I am the majority owner of my own life. And the ledger is finally balanced." Has someone ever mistaken your kindness for weakness? How did you show them your true strength? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice.